Hey everyone. So this presentation is going to be a sort of continuation of and a deeper dive into some of the topics covered in the last presentation, which was about art and rhetoric, the relationship between art and rhetoric, and about beauty itself. I sort of presented that whole thing from a certain point of view with a certain philosophy in mind, sort of my own philosophy, not my own as in I came up with it, but as in the point of view I subscribe to, essentially, that I think is true. And I want to dive deeper into that philosophy as well as the kind of main alternative that people have for thinking about the world, for thinking about things like beauty. This will help you in hopefully all subjects will relate to our definitions essay, will relate to the allegory of the cave, will relate to just your life in general. So let's get started. So again, we left off that last lecture. I talked about art affects the way you see. Right? Art affects the way you see. I left off with that example of the house of God, where certain medical professionals will tell you you have to read this because it's true. Others will say you can't read it because it's not true. And both of them agree at the end of the day is if you read this thing, it's so powerful that it will change the way you view medicine itself. Right? So art affects the way we see, it affects the way we interact with the world. But there are two ways of seeing art or beauty itself. Broadly speaking, you could say that a subjective view is one way or an objective view. Right? I'm taking the objective view. I think beauty is real. I think it's a quality that objects can possess, right? Art objects can possess. And there's the other view, which is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and there's no such thing as sort of objectively true, objectively real beauty. And in order to explain these things, you actually have to go into essentially the main rift in the entire history of Western thought, of Western philosophy. From the time of Socrates on, there was a tradition that has been labeled realism or Platonism. The broad system, which was created again by Plato and Socrates, and is still largely active, right? It still has adherents, even major adherents. But up until the time of Descartes and the Enlightenment, it was really the only way of thinking about things, the only philosophy that was considered true, and every philosopher sort of uh, helped grow this main idea of Plato and Socrates, or these main ideas. Beginning with Descartes and William of Ockham a little bit before, there was a new strain of thinking that branched away from Platonism called naturalism. Naturalism is a philosophy that says the natural world is all that exists. Okay, and we're going to dive into that now. First, I just want to talk very briefly about why this matters. And it matters because our philosophy, the ideas that we subscribe to, are what make up our worldview. Right? We talked about this. By the time you watch this video, we'll have talked probably about the allegory of the cave. That's essentially one of the main takeaways from the allegory of the cave is that in order to understand the cave, in order to understand the world itself, you need to have this sort of meta understanding of it, right? You have your life that you live, and then you have the way that you understand your life, the story you tell about your life, right? The story you tell about the world and what it all means. Which means philosophy isn't just one subject among many, right? It's not like, well, there's philosophy and there's science and there's literature and there. No, the idea is that then philosophy, which sort of creates worldview, it's this meta idea you have about the world. is the baseline. It's how it affects everything. It affects how you see everything about life itself. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is so that I'm not just forcing my worldview onto you without giving you an alternative, without giving you options, without perhaps helping you understand the fact that you have a different worldview, or that you have the same worldview but you hadn't considered certain things about it. I certainly don't want to be like teachers I had, not all teachers, but certainly some teachers who, even in college, right? Again, I think in K through 8 in high school, students probably don't or are sort of growing into the capacity to really think for themselves. And ideally by college, they're being allowed to or being taught even more how to think for themselves while they're learning these subjects. But when I was in college, I certainly had professors who were great. And I also had professors who really forced really strange worldviews onto their students. For one example, I was taking a bunch of classes about other cultures. I'm really interested in Western culture, but I'm also interested in other cultures, of course, of the world at large. So I was taking classes in like Islam. I was taking classes about African music, and I was taking this class about anthropology, just the study of people in other cultures. And I had this anthropology teacher who, and I won't even get into the kind of graphic details he went into, but he basically like delighted in talking about how there are cultures that practice like ritualized pedophilia of their children, and he would tell us these things in graphic detail, and then would say, and you can't question that, you can't say that's wrong because it's not your culture. So he was sort of forcing this relativization of morality on us, right? He was saying you can't criticize anything other cultures do, which is a worldview, that's a philosophy, right? And he wasn't giving us an option to think for ourselves about it, though certainly I'm sure myself and many others did. But the point is, I want to kind of open this up to you, give you a chance to have a different, perhaps, view than me, help understand your own views more, whether or not you more or less align with my own views, things like that. I just want to actually give you an education where you have the chance to think for yourself. And the one of the amazing things before we really dive into it is that broadly speaking, these two worldviews, these two different major philosophies, all stem from a very simple logical difference, which is that Aristotle thought you could trust your senses, and Descartes thought that perhaps you could not. So in Aristotle and Plato and Socrates' view, right, we talked about this with Euthyphro and with the cave, you see examples of things, right? You take them in through your eyes, your ears, etc. From those examples, your mind can abstract into definitions of what those things are, right? So it can see an example of someone behaving justly or unjustly, and it can abstract to then, well, what is justice, right? What is injustice? Descartes thought perhaps you couldn't trust your senses. So, quote, I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. I shall consider myself as not having hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as falsely believing that I have all these things. So he has this thought experiment where he says perhaps the world outside is not trustworthy and perhaps our senses aren't trustworthy. Essentially, what he says is perhaps we're living in a simulation. The way he says it is perhaps a demon has created a false world, right, that tricks us. The modern sort of way of saying it is perhaps we're living in a simulation, is Descartes' idea. If that's true, then we can't trust anything that we see or hear or sense, and we can only trust ultimately our mind, our internal mind. Okay, and from these two premises, entirely different worldviews have sprung. So we'll start with naturalism. Naturalism is, broadly speaking, the philosophies that emerged from Descartes. They emerged from about 1500 up through the present day. And broadly speaking, they hold to these 6 things. First is the idea of materialism. Materialism is the idea that matter is all that exists. The only thing that exists is matter. Okay? And so that's where you get ideas like the mind, right, is only specific firing in the, it's just your neurons firing in the brain. That's how the mind works. Love is only, a dopamine release. Here we find philosophers like Karl Marx. Karl Marx, right, has this materialistic understanding of human beings. He said all human beings are is their financial circumstance, their economic circumstance, their class, right? In Karl Marx's view, there's no such thing as a rich person who's also a good human being, right? Because all you are is your economic state. All wealthy people in Marx's view are evil. All poor people in Marx's view are good and are being lied to, right? So there's no view in Marx of a noble rich person or an immoral poor person, right? He kind of blocks them onto these big chunks because he's a materialist. We also get from here things like identity politics, right? Which says all that matters is your sort of race, your gender, your sex, your whatever, right? These are the only things that you can tell everything essentially about a person from these material truths about them, these material facts. From here, we also get a big one, which is scientism. Scientism is this kind of contemporary phenomenon where people think that the only truth we get out of anything is from science. Everything else is mere opinion or speculation or faith. Science is the only truth. All stems from materialism. Another branch is mechanism, which says all nature is just a machine. So human beings were really just advanced robots, right? From that comes the idea that an AI could just basically just be the exact same thing as a human being. If all we are is an advanced robot, then certainly one day there will be an advanced robot that just is a person, right? This also leads to things like deism, which founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson held to, where God sort of set the universe into like a clock where it just sort of ran itself and he sort of walks away, right? So to like a Jefferson, God exists, but he is absent. He has sort of no participation in our world. Or we get the idea that, again, a lot of scientific philosophers subscribe to now, which is that all of our decisions are really just like neurons firing in our brains. We're sort of helpless to our own actions because we're just sort of this mechanical thing. Okay, we get things like nominalism. Nominalism says that things like justice, love, and so on aren't real. They're not real. They're just arbitrary names we put on things. So here you get, and again, this is a friend of mine said this. He's in law school, and he said, laws, they're really arbitrary. There's no such thing as justice. We just sort of attach laws to things that we want people to do. Right? That means like justice isn't real, and so laws can't be based in justice. They're just based in sort of arbitrary feeling of those in power. Or they're put on by those in power to oppress others, right? That's where a philosopher like Foucault, a philosopher like Derrida fit, is they think everything's just is a structure of power, right? Everything is just built by those in charge to oppress those who aren't in charge. Okay? So that's nominalism. Relativism is similar it basically says there's no such thing as objective truth, or if there's only subjective truth, right? That's where you get things like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Um, Everything is just opinion, right? This sort of thing is why, as Alasdair MacIntyre writes in his book After Virtue, which is something of a modern classic, he writes that we have no way of talking about what's right and wrong anymore because relativism has infected our whole culture, right? You're not allowed to say if something's right or wrong that someone else is doing, largely because we're relativists, largely. Skepticism is next. Skepticism says you should doubt everything. Any sort of definite knowledge is impossible, and we have to live in this constant state of being skeptical of any truth claims, right? And yeah, that's where you get like agnostics. That's where a lot of like atheists come in, a lot of atheist philosophers. It's interesting. Atheist philosophers will talk about how they don't have arguments that prove that God doesn't exist. Their arguments rather say, well, we can't know one way or another, so we might as well not even think about it. That's sort of the skeptical argument. And together, these sort of formulate naturalism, right? They all stem from this idea that, again, the natural world is all that exists. We can't know anything beyond the natural world. Again, I'm not talking about religion necessarily. I think that's involved in it. But even things like you can't know that love is real and what it is. You can't know that justice is real and what it is. You can't know that piety is real and what it is. These things are all they're all kind of not real. They're all sort of just matters of opinion. In the end, is naturalism. And again, that was a break from what's been called realism, or more recently, or Platonism. This general tradition in the spirit of Plato, developing the ideas of Plato, which is a philosophy that can be broadly thought of as reality is really real. Reality is really real, and I would say naturalism is this philosophy of lessness. It's like, oh, you think you're in love, but really just dopamine is firing in your brain. You think justice is real, but it's actually just a construct of those in power, right? It kind of takes these big, beautiful, kind of abstract concepts and makes them smaller. It says, no, they're not really real. And realism says, no, they are. They are. You can know that they are, right? It's a philosophy that says, the love you feel is real. It connects to this idea of universal love, which is a genuine force in reality. Okay? As opposed to naturalisms, again, love is just a dopamine release your body secretes to continue the biological imperative of our species, right? That's a typical naturalist take on something like love. And again, realism would say, well, dopamine does release in your mind, it does release in your brain, and it gives you this kind of warm feeling. At the same time, sticking with your spouse through times of great suffering doesn't give you a dopamine drip. It's totally stopped, right? And the love you feel is actually this higher love, which might be defined as willing the good of the other, right? With the ultimate expression of which is sacrificing your life for someone else's, right? So realism would say, okay, yeah, that scientific thing does happen, and yet there is more. There is more to it than that. So again, it's this philosophy of more-ness. And it's broadly speaking against everything that naturalism is for. Again, in realism, your senses are trustworthy, as is your mind's ability to take what you perceive and abstract them into universal truth. Right? This is the basic illustration of the allegory of the cave. right? Is coming to a greater understanding of things through thinking about them, right? So realism is breaking out of the cave. Naturalism is saying actually the cave is all that exists. If the outside world exists, we can't possibly ever get there. So there's no sense even really talking about it, right? Those are the two sort of distinct philosophies, the two distinct worldviews, broadly speaking, that the Western tradition has taken. As a sort of background, really briefly, again, Descartes puts forward the idea that perhaps we can't trust our senses, right? Perhaps all we can trust is the mind, which is where the famous "I think, therefore I am" comes from, is this idea that you can only trust your mind. You can only trust this interior thing. And William of Ockham, a few centuries before, had put forward the idea that there's no objective truth, that we just attach names to things arbitrarily, essentially, to not get super deep into it. And modern philosophers ran with these ideas. One of the reasons might be, and I'm not going to get super deep into this, but realism tends to be associated with God and with religion, where in naturalism tends to be associated with a kind of agnostic or atheist perspective, broadly speaking. And again, I don't want to get super deep into this because it's just another big subject, right? I'm trying to keep this at a pretty surface level so that we don't get lost in the weeds. But basically, we see even back at Socrates struggling with this in Euthyphro, where he thinks, piety is something beyond the gods. Love is something beyond the gods, right? Which is a crazy thing to say in some sense, but because it seems to go against his religion. But he kind of is pointing toward this other thing that he calls the good, which the Abrahamic religions took up, married to their ideas from their scriptures, their holy texts, and essentially said that thing that Socrates was describing was God, right? Was the source of all reality, the mind of God. God is the good, etc. So like the sun that Socrates is talking about is essentially the mind of God, or the source of all reality, God himself. And that's where realism seems to ultimately lead. All the realist thinkers, even today, largely are religious thinkers as well, right? So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Boethius, Aquinas, Augustine, right? All these people are highly religious people as well, theological people as well. And then the great naturalist thinkers like Sartre, Foucault, Nietzsche, David Hume, even up to today, with who maybe aren't great thinkers, but people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, right, tend to be either agnostic, where they say, well, we just can't know if God is real or not real, so who cares, or are purely atheistic and say, no, God isn't real. There's no sense talking about this. Or they come to, again, like Jefferson, a sort of watchmaker God, sets up the universe and then walks away. Or like Spinoza, another great naturalist, scientist, thinker, says, God really is just the universe. It's like this tree is God, and the grass is God, and the sun is God, and the moon is God. Okay, those are kind of the two, which Einstein himself agrees with. He says, I believe in the God of Spinoza. He basically says the universe is God. And again, just some quotes to, I'm not just blowing smoke here, right? Nietzsche says God is dead. Famously, what he means by that is really that this whole tradition of Christianity and of Socrates is dead. And if it's dead, we have to come up with something else, which is, in a sense, what naturalism is. Bertrand Russell, famous 20th century philosopher, says, I do not pretend to be able to prove that there is no God. I equally cannot prove that Satan is a fiction. The Christian God may exist, so may the gods of Olympus, or of ancient Egypt, or of Babylon. But no one of these hypotheses is more probable than any other. They lie outside the region of even probable knowledge, and therefore there is no reason to consider any of them. Marx likewise says, the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call them out of their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions, right? So Marx says, people dream about heaven because they suffer. What they should really be dreaming about is creating a utopia on Earth, this sort of communist utopia. And even recently, Richard Dawkins, right, one of the new atheists, puts on all these buses in England, there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life, right? Okay. And it may be easier to write this off as simply thinkers in their ivory towers, spinning their nonsense, and it has no effect on real life. And yet it does. And one of the main reasons it does is because teachers are intellectuals, not that I'm necessarily an intellectual, but intellectual in the sense that they think about these things, they've read these works, and then they teach, again, from their point of view. And so if they subscribe to this naturalist thing, then that's what they're going to teach their students, right? And now everyone goes to school, everyone goes to college. And so if most of your teachers are naturalists, you might come away from school with this sort of naturalist conception of things, is kind of the broad, again, very broad, there's more to it than that. But that's sort of the very broad understanding of how these ideas come to really have effect in culture. So you have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeting, the good thing about science is that it's true, whether or not you believe in it, right? So that's scientism. He says, science is the only thing that helps us come to truth. Everything else is just belief. It's just opinion. It's just, well, you choose to believe that, even though there's no proof for it. Simone de Beauvoir, famous, I believe, second wave feminist, says one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, right? So her idea is that there's no such thing as female nature. You essentially grow into it by copying things in the culture, right? Which, again, is a nominalist position. It's saying there's no such thing as woman as a concept, as any sort of truth. You sort of just you take on these qualities as you get older. Ana Navarro of The View fame recently said on a debate on CNN, you may think that as a white man, but as a Latino woman, right, et cetera, which is, again, that sort of identity politics, which is materialism. She's basically saying, we're not speaking to each other on this plane of objective truth. You think what you think because you're white and you're a man, and I think what I think because I'm Latina and I'm a woman. And there can be no real coming together on this, essentially, which is a materialist position. It's this identity politic materialism. Okay? The Enlightenment, right? It's literally saying we're not enlightened by coming out of the cave. We're enlightened by learning science, right? And all that to say is naturalism, broadly speaking, is the air we breathe. It's the water we're swimming in. It's what the culture, broadly speaking, takes to be true, right? So if you haven't given thought to any of these things, you probably have some ideas on both ends, but probably largely you would fall into this kind of naturalist category because it's what many educators think, it's what people in the media think, It's just, again, it's our culture. It's sort of the air we breathe. It has effects in things like art. That was really what the last presentation kind of was about. Was about the naturalist consequences of art and the realist consequences of art, right? So again, if beauty doesn't exist, then art is just another way to communicate a message, or it's a slave to power, or it's a tool of the patriarchy, things like that, right? If it can't communicate beauty, then it has to be something else. And this is even reflected in art criticism. This is, as I was making this presentation, this new movie came out, One Battle After Another, which I really want to see because Paul Thomas Anderson is a really skilled artist. He has a great eye for things. He's great with actors. His actors turn out amazing performances in his movies. There Will Be Blood is like one of my favorite movies ever. I think it's so great. So I really want to see this movie. But the point being, art criticism becomes then not about these sort of artistic qualities of something. It really becomes rhetorical analysis. So you have this big review of a big movie from a major publication, and this is what it says. It is a frightening and galvanizing vision. Anderson putting away his comedy nostalgia for something more easily understood days with disarmingly noble purpose to the here and now. It goes on to say, Anderson is not at all coy in his assertion that Lockjaw and the government he serves are largely motivated by seething racism, a brutish insistence on superiority meant to mask inadequacy and inevitably involving some kind of psychosexual conflict. Lockjaw's desire for perfidia is one of both shame and dominance, a seamy wish to submit to her power as a way to prove its ultimate meaninglessness. He is a vile creation, almost cartoonish in his determined villainy, and he bears a chilling resemblance to real men operating in our world today. Whether or not Anderson plays fast and loose in his blunt depiction of racial politics will no doubt be a matter of some debate, but it is certainly a refreshing jolt to see a big picture like this analyze the squalid motivations of the people currently dispatching the National Guard to major cities and empowering ICE to something far and wide in its cruel project, right? So this isn't, they're not saying like the performances were good or the script the script is really beautiful and tragic or the cinematography frames shots in such and such a way, right? It's not art criticism. It's saying this movie is purely rhetorical, right? Which is a naturalist, again, understanding of film. It's saying that, well, what's good about the reviewer is saying what's good about this movie is that it has convinced me to become a revolutionary. Is essentially what they end up saying. They're like, I haven't really been strong enough in my revolution, and this movie convinced me otherwise. Again, in rhetoric and media, right, if truth doesn't exist or can't be known, all we have is power and manipulation, right? Which is Gorgias's idea, if you remember, and Callicles, that's what they think rhetoric is. And it's an idea we've gone back to in this naturalist world, right? Foucault says there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relation. So everything is power. Everything's about power. It's not about truth. It's about power. Right? So all these things are affected. We have to keep going here. I think quite relevant to you all, this has deeply affected our education and our education systems. Right, if the pursuit of the humanities is meaningless because they don't actually teach you anything, right? They don't teach you anything about science or the natural world, so they can't really be real. Then why teach literature? Why teach philosophy? Why teach theology? Okay, those are especially philosophy and theology, those used to be the cornerstone of education, of university education. Um, the idea was that education was not job training. It was education into getting you out of the cave, coming to contemplate ideas. And that's why, in generations past, even fairly recently, you had these like great scientists, for example, who were also interesting philosophical thinkers, right? So like Oppenheimer was really interested in theology and sacred scriptures of other cultures, quite famously, right? Um, Einstein again was interested in like what God is and coming to some conclusions about that and could speak on it pretty well. You had great philosophers and theologians who were also great scientists or mathematicians, people like Descartes, Spinoza, Pascal. Socrates is a killer mathematician. Anytime he talks about math, it's like, wow, you really like have your stuff down. Aristotle famously was a scientist and wanted to understand like biology and things like that, right? Um, you had philosopher, musician, artists like Aquinas or Hildegard von Bergen, right, who was a nun in the 13th century, who was a great theological thinker who wrote beautiful music also. Or artist scientists like Da Vinci, or kings and rulers and queens who were great thinkers too, right? Famously, people like Marcus Aurelius. Because they had this broader and deeper education that we don't have, that we've abandoned by and large. Now it's compartmentalized. You just sort of learn your subject. It's just job training instead of this broad, holistic education. And then if humanities are taught, they're usually taught with an eye toward naturalism. So art is taught as a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself, right? If you can't study beauty for beauty, you study it to like understand history better, or because it teaches you to identify keywords in texts, or because it proves that Marxism is correct, or things like that, right? Art is then taught essentially to be something else. It's taught as sociology, it's taught as anthropology, it's taught as history, instead of just being taught as art, as its own thing that's about being beautiful. All the humanities go this way, right? History, right, has largely gone toward this materialist understanding, the haves versus the have-nots, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, white colonial man versus native colored people, right? It's this materialist understanding of history. And they all go this way. They all go this way. And then students then are largely pushed towards STEM. And again, STEM is great. And again, look at these great thinkers who were STEM people who are also quite talented musicians or philosophers. STEM is amazing. But it's not everything. It largely doesn't connect to these other truths. It's a naturalist subject. And it even changes how we see, right? Just how we see basic things. I don't know if I have a ton of time to get into this, but Shakespeare says, "It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, though his height be taken." Right? Basically, he's saying there that what's meaningful about a star is everything outside of the scientific facts we can know about it. Our conceptions of things, right? Lewis talks about in his book, The Discarded Image. We used to think of space as the heavens. We used to look to it and find great comfort and structure. And now we look to it and it's kind of large and sublime and frightening and unknown, because we don't have all the facts about it, right? Back then, they didn't have all the facts about it either, but they had this broader, deeper understanding of reality itself. And as T.S. Eliot writes beautifully, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" right? Simply to know the facts about something is not to know the thing itself, is kind of the difference between naturalism and realism. All right, we could go on, we won't. I basically just wanted to give you these examples as applied to this class and maybe your life to some degree, just to show that this is real. This naturalism has broadly become, again, our culture, the water that we swim in. Whether or not it should be is kind of another debate, but that we don't have a lot of time for. The point being, to go back to finally to beauty, this affects the way we see beauty as well. This affects the way we see beauty as well, that we understand aesthetics, which is the study of beauty. And as might be hopefully somewhat more clear to you now, the realist conception of beauty is that beauty is real, it's something that objects can possess, that great artwork possesses, and it points to something divine. It points to something larger than the individual objects, some greater idea of beauty and of reality itself. And the modern turn, the naturalist turn, is to say beauty's not real. We can't really know anything about it, and therefore it's simply in the eye of the beholder, and there's nothing to be done about that. Again, realism, moreness; naturalism, lessness. And as a quick aside, I won't read through all of this, but as a quick aside, realism does account for individual experience as well, right? People's life and their subjective experiences make some beautiful things more or less accessible to them, right? And some people are simply more inclined toward aesthetics than others, right? Some people are more inclined toward being an artist. Some people are more inclined to being a mathematician or a scientist, whatever, right? It accounts for that. A person from England is more likely to find English art, English literature beautiful than someone, say, from China, who would perhaps more easily understand Chinese art or Chinese literature. A person from the South might have easier access to country music or bluegrass music. I was raised traditional Catholic, right, and I love Gregorian chant. And I know other people find it kind of strange or off-putting. I think it's amazing. And I think part of that is because I think it is just beautiful. And I think another part of it is because, well, I've been around it my whole life, right? There's sort of this acceptance of that, right? By way of metaphor, someone first exposed to another culture might find all of its food delicious, right? So you go to Paris, everything you eat is the best thing you've ever eaten. Someone who's lived in Paris their whole life might say, that really isn't that good. You should go here instead. They have better croissants, right? This idea that you grow more discerning the more you're exposed to these things. Okay? Same with habituation. If you read Captain Underpants your whole life and then you try and read War and Peace, good luck. You're probably not going to like it. If you only watch Marvel movies and then you try and watch Citizen Kane or something, you're probably not going to get it, right? Being exposed to good art is important early and often. So yeah, realism accounts for the subjective. Naturalism does not account for the objective. Okay, so I think we kind of get this already. But the consequence basically is that realism also allows us to then actually have a conversation. It actually, because we can meet on this middle ground of ideas, we can actually have productive conversations about things. Whereas naturalism doesn't let that happen, right? Um, uh, I've had a lot of experiences where I've said, something is a good movie, or like, hey, that's a bad movie, or like that song really isn't that good, and like I mean it. I'm like, objectively, it's not good. Like, it is not a good song. It is not a good movie, and people get really mad at me, right? Because they say, "Well, I like it." So what do you mean it's not good? And that's the whole dilemma in a nutshell. In some ways, is um, the naturalist thinks because I like it, therefore it's good. The realist thinks this thing is good, therefore I should like it. I should try to come to understand it more. I should train myself to kind of like better things. And there can often be no dialogue between them, right? When people say that to me, I'll say, I try not to even argue with people about it anymore, because it never goes well, and I just anger people. But the idea is, like, I'm not arguing that you like it. I believe you that you like, it's like that terrible Hallmark movie, I believe you, but it's not really a good movie, and again, people get upset about that, right? You even see this online, right? So, like, there's a famous YouTube music critic, the Needle Drop, right? And he even qualifies every review. He says, "This is just my opinion," and yet all the comments are, how dare you give it an 8 when it's a 9, or I liked this, how come you didn't like it? There's a famous moment where he cried on live stream listening to someone's album, and then he gave it a 7. And the artist said, "How could you give it a 7 when you cried to it?" And again, the idea is like, well, whether or not I felt emotional about it or while listening to it doesn't change the objective qualities that it has. Yeah, so that's sort of the difference. Okay, that allows for, a naturalist might go into the Sistine Chapel and say, "Well, I don't like it. I don't get it," right? And the conclusion is, therefore, it's bad, right? Where a realist would say, "No, it's objectively good. Perhaps if we studied it more, if we talked about it, if I showed you what's good about it, you would come around to seeing the truth that it is beautiful art." Similarly, a realist would see Duchamp's urinal, or fountain rather, and say, "That's bad art." Um, where a naturalist might say, "Well, I like it," right? And again, it's so hard. It's so hard to even have dialogue between those two people, because they're literally coming from two completely different worldviews that have very little in common between them. So it's difficult. To go to some definitions of beauty from both sides, Socrates says, well, I'll skip. That's a long one. It's really good. It's about beauty, and beauty leading us to higher truths. But I don't know that we have time for it, so I'm going to skip it. Plato says, "At the sight of beauty, wings grow on the human soul," which I think is really good. A few more technical ones. Aquinas says, "Beauty relates to the cognitive faculty, for beautiful things are those which please when seen. Hence, beauty consists in due proportion, for the senses delight in things duly proportioned, um, as in what is after their own kind, because even sense is a sort of reason, just as is every cognitive faculty. Now, since knowledge is by assimilation and similarity relates to form, beauty properly belongs to the nature of formal cause." So he's basically saying one of the qualities of beauty is that it's proportional. It's proportioned in a beautiful way. Aristotle likewise says beauty is a matter of size and order, right? It's a matter of things being in harmony with each other. Aquinas goes on to say, for beauty includes 3 conditions: integrity or perfection, since those things which are impaired are by very fact ugly, due proportion or harmony, and lastly, brightness or clarity. When things are called beautiful, which have a bright color. So things have to be have harmony. They have to have integrity of content, and they have to be clear and not vague. Okay, and those are sort of beautiful. It's perhaps what the beautiful is. D.C. Schindler says beauty is goodness and truth on the meeting ground of the sensible. Alice von Hildebrand gives us a negative definition, which relates to what I was just talking about. There are objects that move us for reasons totally foreign to and confused with the aesthetic experiences. Beauty touches us, this object touches me, hence it must be beautiful. This need not be true. So basically what she's saying is, look, just because something moves you doesn't mean it's beautiful, right? The evening news moves me to anger, right? But it doesn't mean it's beautiful. Emotion and emotional response are different than something being beautiful. It's the same distinction Socrates draws out with piety. He says, well, whether or not it's loved by the gods doesn't mean that it's holy or not holy. Von Hildebrand here is saying whether or not you felt something has no effect on whether it's beautiful or not beautiful. Okay? And Keats says a thing of beauty is a joy forever. And then more naturalist definitions. Hume, beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity, where another is sensible of beauty, and every individual ought to acquiesce to his own sentiment, without pretending to regulate those of others. To seek the real beauty or real deformity is as fruitless an inquiry as to pretend to ascertain the real sweet or the real bitter. Right? Beauty is just in the eye of the beholder. You can't really argue about it. You just felt a certain way, and that's just all there is. That's just all that there is. Nietzsche says, at bottom, man mirrors himself in things. He considers everything beautiful that reflects his own image. The judgment beautiful is the vanity of his species. So Nietzsche's just like, there's no such thing as beauty, it's just vanity. I wish I had this whole quote without my face near it, because I think this sums it up really well. Ayer says, such aesthetic words as beautiful and hideous are employed not to make statements of fact, but simply to express certain feelings and evoke a certain response. It follows that there is no sense attributing objective validity to aesthetic judgments, and no possibility of arguing about questions in aesthetics. So he says, like, again, it's just like, it's in the eye of the beholder. You're not really actually saying anything that's really real. So it just is what it is. You know, you like, you think Cars 2 is the greatest film of all time, and I think Lawrence of Arabia is the greatest film of all time. And we're both right and we're both wrong, because beauty isn't real, so it doesn't actually matter. Right? Again, lessness. We're not even able to have a conversation then, because the conversation would simply be, well, that's just how both of us feel. So, and we're both right and we're both wrong, right? Okay. Just to look at a few beautiful art objects. Classic series of tapestries about hunting a unicorn from the Middle Ages. Again, this is a tapestry. Someone wove this. This isn't a painting. It's woven, which is amazing. It's cool. There's like 10 of them or so, and they tell the story of these hunters who hunt down this unicorn, trap it, and then the queen or the princess of this castle befriends the unicorn, and it's lovely. So there's a famous one where the unicorn is in this like this encircling fence. Is very famous. I only didn't put that one up here because everyone has seen it probably, but look it up if you haven't. It's really cool. So again, I think that's very beautiful. I think that's objectively true that it's beautiful. Another tapestry from Raphael, series of tapestries. illustrating the Acts of the Apostles. So this is Paul the Apostle in Greece, I believe. Might be in Rome, actually. Again, he wove this. Here's a great modern artwork called Nighthawks, right? Very beautiful, really captures isolation, like modern social isolation. This man sitting just in this booth all alone at night. Nowhere to go, nowhere to be, no one to talk to. Really amazing painting, really evocative. And as a kind of a side note, that doesn't mean beautiful art can't depict something evil or violent, or I use evil as a broad term, but in the service of a beautiful work of art, right? Fiction is a great example. It often uses evil or flawed characters in the service of a grander narrative, like in Blood Meridian, or like in the painting Guernica, right? Beauty is something that accounts for the whole as well as the specifics, right? So this ugly thing, nevertheless, is depicted well as ugly or as evil or whatever, and yet it contributes to this beautiful whole. I do think that this is a bit of a slippery slope. This is another one of my unpopular opinions, but I think this is a bit of a slippery slope. I think we've come to delight in depicting really horrible things, and I think that's bad for us. That's sort of our contemporary impulse, is to break down boundaries, right? Portray things that haven't been portrayed. And again, I think there are certain things that we probably shouldn't see depicted in art. I think about how pornographic like Game of Thrones is, and everyone watched that. I don't think that's really. I think that's very objectifying. A lot of the actresses have come out and said they felt very objectified. I think it is objectifying. Poor Things, recent movie, won like all the Oscars, or was nominated for all the Oscars, is I think really gross, really obscene. Or The Boys, there's right, that sort of comedy superhero show. I watched it. People recommended it to me. I started watching it, and there's a part really early on where basically a character dies. I won't tell how, but it's when those of you who know, it's the character who dies from the really fast character, like the Flash type character, and the death is just so horrible and like dehumanizing to that character. And there's a lot of dehumanizing stuff in that show, and I think that's probably bad. I think there's probably a limit to the things that we should be depicting. I think there's a lot of wisdom to you not seeing Jocasta kill herself or Oedipus pluck out his eyes in Oedipus Rex. If that were made today, you would see it, right? You'd see it. You'd see Oedipus sleeping with his mother. You'd see all of it, right? Because we sort of have this fascination with pushing the boundaries. Again, I just don't think I think that's probably not good. But again, that's kind of another topic, probably too broad, too deep to cover fully here. Just a thought. The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. Again, lots of crazy, horrible, ugly, nasty things happening in this work, and yet as a whole, it comes together as this beautiful whole. A great iconic work of art. Or Guernica, right? Individually, like everything in this is really ugly and nasty and horrible, and yet it comes together in this tremendous, harmonious way. And the final thought to leave us with is Plotinus, who basically talks about beauty leading us out of the cave. The musician is exceedingly quick to beauty, drawn in a very rapture to it, somewhat slow to stir of his own impulse. He answers at once to the outer stimulus, as the timid are sensitive to noise, so he tones and the beauty they convey. All that offends against unison or harmony in melodies and rhythms repels him. He longs for measure and shapely pattern. This natural tendency must be made the starting point to such a man. He must be led to the beauty that manifests itself through these forms. He must be shown that what ravished him was no other than the harmony of the intellectual world and the beauty in that sphere. Not some one shape of beauty, but the all beauty, the absolute beauty. And the truths of philosophy must be implanted in him to lead him to faith in that which, unknowing it, he possesses within himself. So much of this is going to be cut off, but the born lover has a certain memory of beauty, but severed from it now, he no longer comprehends it. Spellbound by visible loveliness, he clings amazed. His lesson must be to fall down, no longer in bewildered delight before some one embodied form, but rather through a system of mental discipline, he must come to beauty everywhere, and made to discern the one principle underlying it all, etc., etc. Thence onward, he treads the upward way. So again, this idea that beauty, contemplating beauty, leads the mind and the heart upward to more noble things. Which, again, is only an idea even possible through a realist conception of these things, not through a naturalist conception of these things, right? For the naturalist to look at a work of beauty, essentially, as Nietzsche says, you're really just looking at yourself. You're just sort of vainly looking at something that reminds you of perhaps your own beauty, or it's turning you toward your own emotions and you're feeling your feelings, right? So you're just turning inward in the naturalist conception. In the realist conception, you're turning outward. You're coming to a greater understanding of reality itself when you encounter something beautiful and contemplate it. And I'll leave us with this last beautiful work of art, again, I think by Raphael, called The School of Athens, right? This beautiful work that shows all these philosophers in the center. The old man is Plato and the younger man is Aristotle. And sort of just this great illustration, this beautiful painting about the Platonic tradition of people, right? There are men and women in there, right? People trying to come to a deeper and greater understanding of the truth of all things, and the art itself leading you to contemplate that as well. So that's that. I realized that was a lot in a little bit of time. And again, my hope is that if you made it this far, you've at least come to some broad takeaway about perhaps the two different ways to view the world, which again is broadly speaking, but broadly speaking, the two different ways of viewing life and the world, and perhaps some deeper appreciation of your own way of thinking about these things, and perhaps some threads from this presentation that you can pull on in your own pursuit of understanding and of wisdom. So thank you all. Please email me if you have any questions.